doesn't take walk-ins. Get lost before I lose my temper. Please, just tell him it's Isabella Moreau. He may be dangerous to you, but I remember a boy in a storm 15 years ago. He told me, whenever you need me, call my name. I'll burn the world to keep you safe. A long silence follows before the heavy doors groan open. He wants to see you in the penthouse. Follow me. Isabella is led through a clinical, high-tech corridor to a room overlooking the city. Well, Miss Moreau, this is as far as I go. From here, you're on your own. Enzo, stand down. A voice commands from the shadows. Sighs Lorenzo. I can't believe it's you. You're exactly how I pictured you'd become. Isabella Moreau, Lorenzo says, stepping into the light, his scarred face sharp and unreadable. I saved a seat for you 15 years ago. Do you remember what you gave me that night? A place to hide, and my word that I'd never judge you. The girl I never forgot, he whispers. I've been watching for you. What happened? I'm in trouble, Lorenzo. I saw something, a hit by the Volkovs. I need your help. Of course. I owe you my life. I think I brought their war to your doorstep. You did the right thing coming to me. You are under my protection now. You have nothing to worry about. Lorenzo, I haven't told you everything. Viktor Volkov himself saw my face. Viktor Volkov? The room grows cold. He's the butcher of the East Side. Our bloodiest rival. If he knows you saw him, he won't stop until he silences you. I panicked. I didn't know where else to go. Enzo, take care of the perimeter. If a single Russian shadow crosses into my territory, end them. Boss, protecting her means a total war with the Volkovs. We aren't ready for this. That was an order, Enzo. Stand down. Lorenzo turns back to Isabella, his gaze intense. I am willing to take this risk, Isabella. But you have to do everything I say. Anything. I will. To herself, this isn't what I wanted. I just wanted to survive. But when he looks at me like that, his voice sounding like a promise and a threat all at once, I feel a heat I can't explain. I've walked into the lion's den to escape the wolves, and the thought of being his is dangerously thrilling. You were brave enough to come find me, Lorenzo says, his arm wrapping protectively around her. Now be brave enough to stay. From this moment on, you're mine. The penthouse was a cathedral of shadowed glass and cold marble, but as Lorenzo stepped into the spill of the amber desk lamp, the phantom king vanished, replaced by a ghost from a much humbler life. He stood before Isabella, the sharp lines of his black tailored suit a stark contrast to the memory of the shivering, rail-thin boy she had once wrapped in a moth-eaten wool blanket. He reached up, his fingers tracing the faint scar on his cheek, a map of every violent mile he had traveled to return to her. You don't recognize me, do you, Isabella? His voice was a low, resonant scrape that vibrated in the quiet room. But I have never stopped looking at you. Every time I had to do something that took a piece of my soul, I thought of the night the rain was so heavy the world felt like it was drowning, and you were the only person who didn't let me sink. Isabella took a trembling step back, her breath hitching as she looked into his intense, forward-facing gaze. The lethal confidence she had seen in the alleyway was still there, but beneath it was a vulnerability that only she was allowed to witness. The boy from the docks, she whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and dawning trust. Lorenzo, you were just a child. You were so small. I was a nobody, he corrected softly, his arm wrapping firmly around her in a silent promise of protection. I was a runaway with a name that carried no weight and a future that ended at the next street corner. That night, when you fed me and hid me from the men who were hunting my father, you gave me a debt I could never repay with simple words. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the cold blues and reds of the blurred city lights below, the chaos he had eventually mastered. I knew then that the world was built of monsters, and you were too soft for it. You were an artist, Isabella. You lived for beauty and restoration, while I was being forged in fire. I realized that if I ever wanted to be the man who kept his word to you, I couldn't just be a good man. I had to become the most dangerous man in this city. He turned back to her, his sharp, symmetrical features set in a grim, controlled line. Every territory I took, every rival I broke, was a brick in a fortress I was building for you. I spent 15 years becoming a king just so that if the day ever came where you had to call my name, I would be a man worth your protection. Isabella's grip on his chest tightened instinctively. The reality of his world, the smoke-filled rooms and the silver-tongued betrayals, felt like a rising tide, but the heat of his presence was an absolute anchor. She had walked into the den of the city's most feared predator, only to find that the beast had been raised on her own kindness. I called your name because I was afraid to die, she admitted, her voice cracking as the danger she hadn't chosen finally caught up to her. Lorenzo moved closer until their shadows merged against the marble floor. He didn't look possessive, but his posture was that of a man shielding her from an unseen enemy. You called because you knew I would answer, he said, his hand coming up to gently cup her face, his thumb brushing over her soft features. The Volkovs think they are hunting a witness. They don't realize they have touched the only thing in this world I truly care about. They wanted a war, Isabella. I will give them one that burns until there is nothing left but your safety. In that moment, the elegance of his penthouse felt like a gilded cage, yet it was the only sanctuary left in a world of shadows. Isabella looked up at him, seeing the lethal confidence of the king and the heart of the boy she had once saved, and she realized her life would never be quiet again. The transition from the clinical safety of the penthouse to the dust-moated air of Isabella's restoration studio felt like stepping back into a dream that was rapidly turning into a nightmare. Lorenzo didn't allow her to go alone. He moved with a silent, predatory grace, his presence a dark weight against the vibrant canvases and half-restored frescoes. He had insisted on retrieving her father's journal, the one item that held the key to the rare artifacts Viktor Volkov so desperately coveted. Isabella's hands shook as she moved through the rows of marble busts, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was a restorer, someone who breathed life into the past, now hunted by men who only knew how to create silence. Stay behind me, Lorenzo murmured, his voice a low vibration that barely disturbed the stillness. He didn't look at the art. His intense, forward-facing gaze was fixed on the perimeter, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering neon of a nearby street lamp. He moved with a lethal confidence that suggested he wasn't just anticipating a threat, he was inviting it to show itself. The first sign of the breach wasn't a sound, but a thin, needle-like beam of crimson light. It cut through the dimness of the studio, dancing across the throat of a Roman goddess before settling squarely on the center of Isabella's chest. She froze, her breath hitching in a throat tight with terror. The red laser was a countdown, a digital finger on a trigger. In a single, fluid motion of quiet dominance, Lorenzo's arm wrapped firmly around her, yanking her behind the solid mahogany of her workbench just as the first suppressed round shattered a vial of linseed oil. He didn't panic. He didn't even breathe heavily. He looked like a man operating in his natural element, the shadows. Don't move, he commanded, the words a cold promise of safety. The Volkov hit squad moved with professional precision, for silhouettes detached from the darkness, their boots clicking softly on the hardwood floors. They were the butchers of the East Side, men who had turned the city into a graveyard. But Lorenzo was the Phantom King, and this was his city. He rose from behind the bench not with a shout, but with the terrifying efficiency of a machine. The studio erupted into a muted symphony of violence. Lorenzo didn't waste movement. He was a blur of black silk and steel, a flash of a blade, the muffled thud of a body hitting the floor, and the sharp, rhythmic cracks of his own suppressed sidearm echoed through the vaulted ceiling. He moved through the red laser sights as if they were nothing more than cobwebs, his expression remaining calm and unshaken as he eliminated the threat in seconds. When the silence returned, it was heavier than before, thick with the scent of gunpowder and expensive cologne. Lorenzo stood in the center of the room, his black tailored suit barely ruffled, his gaze already searching the shadows for the next variable. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like the monster he had become to ensure Isabella never had to be one. He turned to her, his posture shifting from lethal to protective in an instant. He reached out, his hand steady as he helped her up from the floor. Isabella pressed against him, her grip on his chest tight and instinctive. She looked at the fallen men, the danger she hadn't chosen, and then back at the man who had spent 15 years building an empire just to be standing here, between her and the dark. "The studio is compromised," Lorenzo said, his thumb brushing over her cheek, his voice returning to that low, anchoring scrape. "We have what we came for. Now, we return to the penthouse. The war has officially begun, Isabella, and you are the only prize I intend to keep." The DeSantis penthouse was less of a home and more of a high-altitude fortress, a sprawling expanse of glass and cold, blue-toned marble that mirrored the unforgiving winter sky outside. As the elevator doors hissed shut, sealing away the adrenaline-soaked air of the studio, Isabella felt the transition into Lorenzo's world like a physical weight. This was the inner sanctum, a place of clinical luxury where every surface was polished to a lethal shine and every shadow felt curated. She stood in the center of the vast living area, her breath misting in the surgical crispness of the air, feeling like a fragile piece of porcelain misplaced in a hall of steel. Lorenzo moved through the space with the silent, practiced ease of a king returning to his throne. He shed his jacket, revealing the holster strapped to his broad shoulders, a reminder that even in this sanctuary, peace was an armed truce. Isabella's eyes wandered to the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the city lights flickered in reds and blues, a beautiful, chaotic landscape she was no longer permitted to touch. She was safe, yes, but it was a sanctuary defined by walls and armed sentries. "You look like you're searching for an exit that doesn't exist," Lorenzo remarked, his voice a low, resonant scrape that cut through the silence. He was leaning against a marble pillar, his intense, forward-facing gaze fixed on her with a heat that stood in stark contrast to the room's chilly aesthetic. Isabella looked up, meeting his eyes, and felt her skin prickle. There was no surveillance lens or glass barrier between them now. There was only the raw, magnetic pull of a man who had reshaped his entire life to become her shield. "It's just so quiet," Isabella whispered, her hand instinctively finding the silver locket beneath her sweater. "In my studio, there was always the sound of the street, the smell of the river. Here, everything feels like it's waiting for something to break. In this world, Isabella, the quiet is the only luxury we have," Lorenzo said, walking toward her with a deliberate, predatory grace. He stopped inches away, his presence an absolute anchor in the sterile room. He didn't touch her, but the proximity was enough to make her heart hammer against her ribs. "The Volkovs are scouring every alleyway for you. They are screaming your name in the dark. But here, they cannot reach you. Here, you are the only variable I care to protect." He reached out, his thumb catching the light as it brushed the air near her cheek, a gesture of restraint that felt more intimate than a touch. Isabella looked at the faint scar on his cheek, a mark of the violence he had endured to build this gilded cage. She saw the lethal confidence of the Phantom King, but beneath it, she still sensed the boy who had once sought refuge in her kindness. "You call it a cage," Lorenzo murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes with a fierce, protective intensity. "I call it the only place where I can keep my vow. You are mine to guard, Isabella, and I have waited 15 years to make this penthouse a place worthy of you." He turned and walked toward the bank of monitors in the corner, his silhouette sharp against the city's neon glow. Isabella watched him, a mix of fear and an undeniable, dangerous thrill stirring in her chest. She was trapped in a world of silver-tongued betrayals and smoke-filled rooms. But as she looked at Lorenzo, she realized that the bars of this cage were forged from a devotion she didn't yet fully understand. She moved toward the window, her hand pressing against the cold glass, looking out at the world she had lost and the man she had found in the shadows. The heavy silence of the penthouse was broken only by the sound of ice clinking in a glass. Lorenzo had been called away to a secure line, leaving Isabella alone in the sprawling expanse of marble and cold blue light. She stood by the window, watching the neon pulse of the city, until the reflection of another man appeared in the glass. It was Enzo, Lorenzo's underboss, a man whose symmetrical features were always arranged in a look of professional discipline that never quite reached his eyes. "It's a long way down, isn't it?" Enzo asked, his voice a smooth, silver-tongued drawl that lacked the raw, protective rasp of Lorenzo's. Isabella turned, her grip tightening on the edge of a nearby table. "Lorenzo said I was safe here." "Safe?" Enzo let out a dry, hollow laugh, stepping into the dim light. "You're in a fortress built on gunpowder, Isabella. Lorenzo is a man who operates in shadows, a predator who spent 15 years building an empire out of blood and fire. But ever since you arrived, he's been playing the role of the knight. He's distracted. He's making mistakes. And in our world, mistakes are paid for in casualties." He walked closer, his presence lacking the magnetic pull of his boss, replaced instead by a clinical, manipulative coldness. "The Volkovs are screaming your name in the dark. As long as you are here, this penthouse is a target. Lorenzo thinks he can protect you, but he's blinded by a debt from a boy's past. He's willing to burn the world to keep his vow, but he'll likely burn with it." Isabella felt a chill that the climate-controlled air couldn't account for. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I care about this family," Enzo whispered, leaning in until he was just outside her personal space. "And because I see a woman who didn't choose this danger. You're an artist, a restorer of beauty. You don't belong in a world of silver-tongued betrayals and smoke-filled rooms. If you stay, you'll watch him die for you. Is that the memory you want to restore?" He reached into his tailored suit and pulled out a small, encrypted key card. "There's a private transport waiting at the service entrance. It'll take you to the border. No questions, no trail. You can disappear. You can go back to being Isabella Moreau, the woman who never saw a hit, instead of the woman who destroyed the DeSantis empire." Isabella looked at the card, her mind a chaotic landscape of pursuit and unseen enemies. The gilded cage felt smaller than ever. For a moment, the fear of the Volkovs and the weight of the war made her hand tremble toward the card. "Is this what he wants?" she asked, her voice cracking. "He wants to protect you," Enzo lied smoothly, "but he's too proud to admit that his protection is the very thing killing him. Be the brave girl he remembers. Save him by leaving." Isabella stared into Enzo's intense gaze, searching for a trace of the lethal confidence she saw in Lorenzo, but she found only the glint of an ambitious man removing a variable from an equation. She thought of the boy from the storm and the man who had wrapped his arm firmly around her in a silent promise. "He told me I was the only variable he cared to protect," she said, her posture shifting from vulnerable to a sudden, quiet strength. She pulled her hand back from the card. "If Lorenzo wants me gone, he'll tell me himself. Until then, I think you should leave my room, Enzo." The underboss's expression darkened for a split second, a flash of the monster beneath the suit, before his professional mask slid back into place. "As you wish, Miss Moreau. But remember, shadows have a way of closing in when the light gets too bright." As he slipped back into the darkness of the hallway, Isabella turned back to the window. Her skin felt on fire, the dangerous thrill of her situation clashing with the terror Enzo had tried to plant. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was in the center of a war she didn't choose, and for the first time, she realized that trust was the only weapon she truly had. The training room was a subterranean vault of brushed steel and soundproofed padding, a stark departure from the cold blue luxury of the floors above. Lorenzo stood in the center of the fluorescent glare, his black tailored suit discarded for a dark, form-fitting tactical shirt that emphasized his broad shoulders and the quiet strength of a man who operated in shadows. On the table between them lay a 9mm handgun, its matte finish looking like a piece of industrial death against the silver metal. Isabella stood before it, her soft features tight with a mix of fear and uncertainty. Her hands, usually reserved for the delicate touch of a restorer's brush, hovered over the weapon as if it might bite. "I don't belong in this world, Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice echoing in the sterile silence. "I fix things that are broken. I don't break things. Viktor Volkov doesn't care about your art, Isabella, Lorenzo replied, his voice a low, resonant scrape that anchored her. He moved behind her, his presence an absolute shield. He only cares that you are a variable he hasn't eliminated yet. If the shadows close in, I need to know you can push back. He reached around her, his arms wrapping firmly around her, not in possession, but in a silent promise of protection. He guided her hands to the weapon. His skin was warm against hers, a sharp contrast to the cold steel. Hold it. Not like it's glass. Like it's an extension of your will. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, her grip instinctive and tight as he adjusted her fingers. The proximity brought the intense heat of his gaze to the nape of her neck, a dangerous thrill that made her skin feel on fire. Spread your feet. Lean into the threat, Lorenzo commanded softly. He placed his hand over hers, his thumb brushing against her knuckles as he helped her take the weight of the gun. In my world, fear is a luxury we can't afford. You have to be ready to anticipate the danger before it arrives. He signaled the target, a silhouette at the end of the range. Isabella's breath hitched. She felt vulnerable, caught in a world of silver-tongued betrayals and smoke-filled rooms she never chose. But as Lorenzo's chest pressed against her back, she felt a surge of quiet strength. Focus on the front sight. Forget the Volkovs. Forget Enzo. There is only the target, he murmured into her ear. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion of the shot was a violent shock that sent a tremor through her frame, but Lorenzo didn't let her recoil. He held her steady, his grip firm and unshaken, signaling that as long as he stood, nothing would touch her. Again, he urged. They spent hours in that high-stakes rhythm. With every magazine, Isabella's fear began to transform into a cold, clinical focus. She was no longer just a trembling witness. She was learning to navigate the lethal confidence of the DeSantis empire. In the moments between shots, as they stood in the heavy silence of the vault, a new kind of trust was forged, one made of gunpowder and shared survival. Lorenzo stepped back, his intense gaze searching hers for any sign of breaking. You're brave enough to stay, Isabella, he said, his voice dropping to a low, melodic anchor. And you're brave enough to protect what's yours. Isabella looked at the weapon in her hand, then back at the man who had become a monster just to keep her safe. The danger was imminent, and the enemies were closing in, but for the first time, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a partner. The grand ballroom of the DeSantis Plaza was a shimmering sea of crystal chandeliers and hollow pleasantries, a world of high society elegance that felt like a fragile mask over the city's violent heart. Isabella stood at the top of the marble staircase, her breath caught in her throat as she smoothed the silk of her floor-length emerald gown. For years, she had moved through these circles as a restorer, a ghost in the background of wealth. Now, she was stepping out as the consort of the Phantom King. Lorenzo stood beside her, a pillar of lethal confidence in an all-black tailored tuxedo that seemed to absorb the light around him. He didn't look like a man at a party. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield. As Isabella's hand trembled slightly, he reached out, his arm wrapping firmly around her waist. The warmth of his touch was an absolute anchor against the cold blues of the room's diamond-studded decor. Head up, Isabella, he murmured, his voice a low, resonant scrape that only she could hear. They are looking for a victim. Show them a queen. As they descended, the room fell into a suffocating silence. The silver-tongued betrayals of the city's elite stalled mid-sentence. Isabella felt the weight of 1,000 gazes, but she kept her eyes fixed forward, mirroring Lorenzo's intense, forward-facing stare. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was the prize and the power of the DeSantis empire. The atmosphere shifted from stiff formality to icy dread when the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall swung open. Viktor Volkov stepped into the light. He was a man of jagged edges and predatory stillness, his presence a dark stain on the evening's forced glamour. He didn't come with an invitation. He came with a message. Lorenzo, Viktor called out, his voice a guttural rasp that sliced through the orchestral music. I see you found something worth restoring. A pity she has such a short shelf life. Lorenzo didn't flinch. His grip on Isabella's waist tightened instinctively, signaling a silent promise. Nothing touches you while I'm standing. Victor, you're outside your territory. In this house, you are nothing but a ghost waiting to be exorcised. The confrontation was a spark in a room filled with gas. Victor's eyes, cold and devoid of humanity, settled on Isabella with an expressive depth of hatred. She saw what she shouldn't have. And you, Lorenzo, have grown soft, hiding behind a woman's skirts. I am not hiding, Isabella said, her voice surprising her with its quiet strength. She stepped slightly in front of Lorenzo, her grip on his hand tight, her posture reflecting the vulnerable yet strong resolve forged in the training room. I am standing exactly where I belong. Victor's laugh was a dry, hollow sound. He raised a hand, and the crystal-shattered piece of the gala disintegrated. From the shadows of the balcony, the first red laser sights began to dance across the white linen tablecloths. Get down, Lorenzo roared, his quiet strength erupting into explosive action. He tackled Isabella to the floor just as the first suppressed rounds shattered the chandeliers, raining glass down like diamonds soaked in blood. The ballroom turned into a chaotic landscape of pursuit and unseen enemies. Lorenzo was a blur of lethal efficiency, his black suit a shadow among the screaming guests. He didn't just protect Isabella. He moved through the carnage with a controlled fury, eliminating the Volkov hit men with the same cold discipline she had seen in the vault. Amidst the smoke-filled room and the silver-tongued pleasantries turned to death rattles, Isabella realized the gilded cage was gone. The war was no longer hidden in shadows. It was here, in the light, and the only line of safety was the man who refused to let go of her hand. As Lorenzo hauled her toward the service exit, his face splattered with the red cost of his vow, Isabella knew the transition was complete. She wasn't just surviving the war, she was part of it. The aftermath of the gala felt like a descent into a neon-soaked purgatory. The cool, dark tones of the city night were stained by the erratic pulse of emergency lights as Lorenzo guided Isabella through the maintenance tunnels of the plaza. His breathing was heavy, a ragged sound that tore at Isabella's heart. In the chaos of the ballroom, he had taken a bullet for her, a crimson bloom spreading across the shoulder of his black-tailored suit. Yet, even wounded, his arm remained wrapped firmly around her, a silent promise that he was still her last line of safety. The extraction point is 2 blocks north, Lorenzo rasped, his lethal confidence flickering but not fading. Enzo will have the armored transport waiting. But when they emerged into the rain-slicked alleyway, the only thing waiting was a circle of DeSantis guards with their weapons drawn. At the center stood Enzo, his symmetrical features twisted into a mask of silver-tongued betrayal. The Phantom King had been led into a trap by his own underboss. I told her to leave, Lorenzo, Enzo said, his voice cold and devoid of the heat that defined his boss. I gave her a chance to save you, but you're both too blinded by a boy's vow. The family needs a leader, not a martyr for a distraction. Traitor, Lorenzo spat, his grip on Isabella tightening as he struggled to stand tall despite his blood loss. The betrayal was a spark that turned the cold blue night into a furnace of chaos. Before Enzo could give the order to fire, a Volkov hit squad, trailing the scent of blood, erupted from the shadows behind them. The alley turned into a 3-way slaughterhouse. In the confusion of the sudden crossfire, Isabella didn't freeze. The lessons in lethality she had endured in the vault surged to the surface. As Lorenzo slumped against a brick wall, his strength finally failing, Isabella grabbed his sidearm. She didn't fire at the men, she fired at the overhead electrical transformer. The explosion was a blinding flash of white light and sparks that plunged the alley into total darkness. Move, Isabella hissed, her voice finding a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. She draped Lorenzo's heavy arm over her shoulders, her grip on his chest instinctive and desperate. Using her knowledge of the city's architectural history, she didn't head for the main roads where Enzo's men or Volkov's butchers would be hunting. Instead, she dragged Lorenzo toward the old basement entrance of the Restoration Museum 2 blocks away. She moved through the shadows with a predatory grace she had learned from the man now leaning on her for survival. Inside the museum's damp, stone-walled cellar, the air smelled of dust and ancient secrets. Isabella found an old, unmarked service van used for transporting rare artifacts, a vehicle that existed on no digital manifest. She loaded Lorenzo into the back, his face pale and eyes clouded with pain. "Isabella," he murmured, his hand reaching out to touch her soft features, now streaked with grease and blood. You should go. I am the only variable you have left, Lorenzo," she whispered, her expressive eyes filled with a mix of fear and absolute trust. She climbed into the driver's seat, her hands steady on the wheel. "You spent 15 years becoming a man worth my protection. Now it's my turn." She gunned the engine, the van's headlights cutting through the blurred city lights as she steered them toward the outskirts. The bridges were burning behind them, and the shadows were closing in, but for the first time, the Phantom King wasn't the one doing the guarding. Isabella Moreau was smuggling a king out of his own fallen empire, her heart forged under the threat of a war she was finally ready to win. The wind howled across the summit of the DeSantis Plaza, a predatory shriek that tore at Isabella's hair as she lay prone on the cold, corrugated steel of the mechanical ledge. The city below was a blurred tapestry of neon reds and icy blues, a world of chaos she had once viewed from behind the safety of a restorer's glass. Now, the weight of a long-range rifle was the only thing anchoring her to reality. Through the high-powered optic, the world was reduced to a crosshair and a single, desperate heartbeat. 50 feet away, on the helipad bathed in the strobe of a dying lightning storm, the Phantom King was fighting for his life. Lorenzo's black suit was shredded, his white shirt stained a deep, visceral crimson where his wound had reopened. He moved with a ragged, lethal confidence, but the blood loss was slowing his predatory grace. Facing him was Viktor Volkov, a man who looked like a shadow carved from stone. Viktor didn't use a gun. He used a combat knife and a relentless, guttural fury, sensing that the empire he wanted to crush was finally within his grasp. "Look at you, Lorenzo," Viktor's voice carried over the wind, a rasping taunt. "The great king, brought down by a soft-featured girl. You traded your crown for a witness, and now you'll die in the dirt like a common dog." Lorenzo didn't answer with words. He parried a strike, his broad shoulders tensing as he drove a fist into Viktor's ribs. The sound of the impact was a dull thud against the roar of the gale. Isabella watched through the lens, her finger trembling against the trigger. Her soft features were tight, her expressive eyes filled with a terror she was fighting to transform into the lethal confidence Lorenzo had tried to instill in her. "Focus on the front sight. Forget the shadows. There is only the target." In the scope, she saw Viktor catch Lorenzo with a brutal kick to the chest, sending the wounded king sprawling toward the edge of the roof. Lorenzo's hand gripped the concrete lip, his body hanging over the 1,000-foot drop. Viktor stepped forward, the silver blade of his knife catching the red pulse of a nearby aircraft warning light. He raised the weapon for the final, descending blow. "Lorenzo!" Isabella's silent scream died in her throat. The wind shifted. For a split second, the world went still. Isabella felt the instinctive, tight grip of her hand on the stock. She wasn't the trembling witness from the alleyway anymore. She was the woman who had sheltered a boy in a storm, and she was the woman who would not let that boy be snuffed out by a butcher. She adjusted for the windage, her breath hitching one last time before she forced her lungs to go empty. The crack of the rifle was a thunderclap that silenced the city. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, a violent jolt of reality, but she didn't look away. Through the glass, she saw Viktor Volkov's head snap back, the crimson mist of the impact briefly obscuring the red laser sights of the city. The butcher fell, not with a scream, but with a sudden, heavy finality, his body tumbling back into the shadows he had emerged from. Isabella dropped the rifle, her hands shaking as she scrambled toward the helipad. Lorenzo was pulling himself up, his face pale and etched with a profound, aching survival. He slumped against the base of the antenna array, his intense, forward-facing gaze finding hers through the dark. He didn't look at the fallen monster. He looked only at the woman who had stepped out of the gilded cage to save him. As she reached him, her grip on his chest was instinctive and fierce, her tears mixing with the rain. Lorenzo's arm wrapped firmly around her, his touch no longer just protective, but reverent. "You did it, Isabella," he whispered, his voice a low, resonant scrape of pride. "You anticipated the threat." "I saved my king," she sobbed, pressing her face against his neck. The war wasn't over. Enzo was still out there, and the city was still a landscape of pursuit. But as they sat together at the highest point of their fallen empire, the Phantom King and his restorer were no longer protector and protected. They were a single, lethal force, forged under a threat that had failed to break them. The scars of the rooftop war remained etched into the skyline of the city, but within the private chapel of the De Santis estate, the air was heavy with the scent of white lilies and the quiet promise of a new era. The cold blue isolation that had once defined Lorenzo's world had been replaced by a soft, golden warmth. The silver-tongued betrayals had been silenced. Enzo had been purged along with the remnants of the Volkov syndicate, leaving behind a kingdom that was no longer a fortress of shadows, but a home. Lorenzo stood at the altar, a figure of absolute power and quiet strength. He wore a black tailored suit that fit him like armor, though today, his expression held no trace of the Phantom King's lethal edge. His gaze was fixed on the back of the chapel, intense and forward-facing, waiting for the only person who had ever seen the boy beneath the scars. When the doors opened, Isabella appeared, a vision of soft light and resilient beauty. She moved with a predatory grace that had been forged in fire, her emerald eyes no longer filled with the paralyzing fear of a witness, but with the steady resolve of a partner. Her white silk gown flowed behind her like a restored masterpiece, a contrast to the violence they had survived. As she reached him, her grip on his hands was instinctive and tight, not a plea for safety, but a declaration of belonging. Lorenzo took her hands in his thumbs brushing over her knuckles with a reverence that made the rest of the world fall away. 15 years ago, I was a runaway with nothing but a name I hated, he said, his voice a low, resonant scrape that vibrated through the small chapel. You gave me a reason to survive the storm. I spent every day since then building a world where you would never have to be afraid again. I became a monster so that you could remain an artist, but you showed me that I didn't have to face the dark alone. Isabella looked up at him, seeing the man who had burned the world to keep his word. You didn't just build a fortress, Lorenzo. You built a life for us. I came to you to escape the wolves, but I stayed because I found the only man who truly sees me. You are my king, and I am your shield. In the presence of a few loyal guards and the hushed shadows of the chapel, they exchanged vows that were less about tradition and more about survival. When Lorenzo slid the diamond band onto her finger, it felt like the final piece of a broken artifact being clicked back into place. He leaned in, his arm wrapping firmly around her waist, pulling her into the heat of his presence. Nothing touches you while I'm standing, he whispered against her lips, repeating the silent promise that had guided his ascent. And nothing breaks you while I'm by your side, she replied. As they turned to face the chapel doors, stepping out into a world that was still dangerous, but finally theirs to command, they didn't look like a protector and the protected. They represented a love forged under threat, a union of power and vulnerability that had survived the ultimate test. The Phantom King had his queen, and the boy from the storm had finally come home to the woman who had saved him. The war was over, but their story, a masterpiece of blood, restoration, and absolute trust, was only just beginning.